Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. It's hosted by CLS, or Steve Johnson at CLS, who's going to talk today about Japanese knotweed and property purchases and what law firms can do to counter the threat. So I would just, before we start, and I hand over to Steve, I would just like to draw your attention to the Zoom software. At the bottom of the software, you should have the ability to either chat or to Q&A. If you've got questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom, and then we will try and answer all the questions at the very end of the webinar. After the webinar is complete, we will obviously share with you the slides and the recording, which takes up to about a day to actually do. So that'll be tomorrow. So Steve, without further ado, I'll hand over to you to conduct today's webinar.
Thanks very much, Adam, and hello, everyone. I don't mind admitting it's always a slightly surreal start to these presentations when I see a photo of myself with my pre-corona haircut and suit and tie staring back at me. I am looking forward to the ability to get a haircut because it's looking a little bit shaggy at the moment, but nonetheless, the suit and tie is there staring back at you as well. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the series of InfoTrack webinars. And as Adam said, I'm Steve Johnson, Account Manager at CLS Property Insight, and our topic today is Japanese knotweed and property purchases. Obviously a topic that has been around in property for quite some time, but got particular prevalence with the revision of the guidance to the TA6 form quite recently. So we'll take you through a number of different topics relating to Japanese knotweed. If you hear any background noise, my apologies. I'm presenting from the house where the kids and our mother-in-law are also present. So hopefully we won't have too many interruptions as we go through. So we'll be looking at what actually is Japanese knotweed. We'll look at the origins of how it arrived in the country, how it came to perform a little bit of a blight, to say the least, on the UK property sector. We'll look at how to identify it and to notice its changing appearance throughout the seasons, and that might be a cue to just nip off into your gardens to see if you've got anything that looks like the photos poking through. I sincerely hope not. We'll look at how the plant behaves, its ability to damage and obviously devalue potentially property as well. But also we'll consider the implications of having it and dealing with it or not dealing with it. There is no statutory obligation to eradicate Japanese knotweed if it's on your property, but there are clearly requirements to stop its spread, particularly if it ends up going into neighbouring gardens. Plus there's of course the self-interest of not allowing it to spread to the point where it can start to damage your property as well. So we'll highlight some of the legislation that covers Japanese knotweed and indeed other invasive species. I know we've had a question come through just before we started on giant hogweed as well. And we'll also look at some of those legal exposures that can result from Japanese knotweed and what the management plan options are for those of you that either personally have encountered it or of course have clients that encounter it as well. We'll then move on to the TA6 form and the changes that have come in, and maybe how you may choose to react to those changes. And we'll consider the insurance solution from CLS Property Insight, which I think is quite timely given the changes to the TA6 form guidance. But we'll start with a little bit of a history lesson. Cart yourselves back to the Victorian era. It was a time of excitement and exploration, and with the first industrial revolution in full swing, many of the things we still use today were born of that never-ending Victorian quest to make life easier for some and more glamorous or interesting for others. And they brought us the bicycle, the electric kettle, it sounds like quite a nice antique there, photography, the electric light bulb, and Fallopia japonica. A beautiful decorative garden plant that was also edible and could even be harvested for cattle feed. Little did they know that at the time they had brought into the UK what would later become one of the most destructive invasive species in history, and that's genuinely not to overstate it. It's a remarkably destructive plant across the planet. It causes millions of pounds worth of blight to the UK property industry, whether it's residential or commercial. But as I say, it had quite innocent origins back in the Victorian era. Now, as when all things go wrong, it's always good to have someone to blame. And in this particular case, may I introduce Philipp Franz Balthasar von Siebold, a pioneering German botanist who spent most of his life studying Japanese flora and fauna. He achieved a great many things. He's renowned in his field at the time, but unfortunately it was he, ladies and gentlemen, who introduced Japanese knotweed to Europe, and it's for that that he's primarily remembered. it would appear that Japanese knotweed was part of a collection of live plants presented to Siebold by his Japanese hosts and transported back to Europe thereafter. Fallopia japonica was particularly well received, and it was initially housed in a acclimatization garden in the Netherlands, but was such a hit to the point where it even received a gold medal from no less than the Utrecht Society of Agriculture and Horticulture. But from the Netherlands, the attractiveness and robust nature of the plant led to popularity across Europe. And again, such was the Victorians' love and fascination of the plant that it featured in the Edinburgh Royal Botanical Gardens and was frequently the subject of artist drawings and paintings. But it was only once the plant was established in the UK that its destructive nature was realized. Now, Japanese knotweed is, as the name suggests, a fast-growing plant native to East Asia. And ironically, Japan is one of the few countries for whom Japanese knotweed poses no problems. In Japan, it competes with a variety of comparable plants, as well as being vulnerable to local pests, diseases, fungi, and invertebrates. And in fact, in some regions of Japan, it's seen as a positive, as it's a pioneer species and is able to establish itself on lava left by volcanic eruptions, Japan obviously being quite a volcanic country. And its presence leads on to secondary foliation and ultimately to the natural world gaining a foothold in what were previously bare lava slopes. However, in areas like the UK, A, we don't have any volcanoes, but B, we don't have those balancing factors, allowing Japanese knotweed, unfortunately, to outcompete other local plants very quickly and successfully. And it does so by having a continuously growing root system called rhizomes, which seek out nutrients and then steal them very effectively from any living plant nearby. Now, although the plant is hugely destructive, it's not toxic and is in fact edible. It's been used to make bread, chutney, and even alcoholic drinks in the past. But during the spring and summer, it grows rapidly. 10 centimeters a day is not uncommon, and it has been recorded at 20 centimeters a day, although that's unusual. And the growths it produces are typically between 2 to 3 meters tall. Now, one of the things that can make it difficult to identify is that throughout the year, it takes on very different appearances. And then when you get to the autumn and winter, those growths die, forming just sort of, brown sort of shell-like stems. But then the next growth starts again as the next spring season comes along. So let's have a look at what the visual appearance of Japanese knotweed looks like. And this is something, for those of you that even if you don't have it present in your properties, and obviously most of you will not, it's worth drawing your client's attention to what this plant actually looks like in the event that they're actually going around and looking at different times of the year, whether it's that sort of dead period during autumn and winter or the growing period in spring and summer. The plant takes on quite different forms and appearances throughout its annual cycle, and this can make identifying it quite difficult. It can get mistaken for other plants, particularly in amongst them, plants such as bindweed, Russian vine, broadleaf dock, and ground elder, for those of you that are gardeners. Now, the photograph on the far left shows the knotweed shoot bursting through a tarmac driveway in early spring. The knotweed buds in spring resemble small, bright red buds, which will sprout from the crown of the plant, and the shoot takes on the form of sort of reddish purple shoots sprouting from the ground, similar in appearance to asparagus. As we go into the summer, the Japanese knotweed stems will grow into hollow reddish green stems with deep green leaves, and these stems can shoot up to 3 meters in height. At this stage, they're often mistaken for bamboo, as the height and color of the shoots can be very similar in appearance, although bamboo doesn't grow anywhere near as fast. In summer, leafy vegetation forms over the plants that are heart-shaped, light green in color, and then die off in the autumn. And in the summer, it also develops these quite distinctive, small, creamy white flowers that cluster together on the vines. So if you see sort of any of the appearance of a plant that looks similar to what you're seeing on screen, or your clients see those, that's the time to start really paying attention, because what you almost certainly have is a Japanese knotweed outbreak. As I say, the plant's foliage does die in the winter, and it leaves these sort of brown, brittle canes, very, very dry, which over time will break down. But they will re-emerge in the summer with those little asparagus-like red tips. And it's this undistinctive but changing cycle that acts as a defense, as it blends quite effectively into nearby shrubbery while the spread is immature, but at the same time denies them daylight or nutrients, giving them a chance to sort of overtake and become the dominant plant in a particular location. Now, I'm sure as we spent lots of time in our gardens, you may be having a quick check around after this presentation, maybe just to see if you have anything similar. But to be honest with you, the comfort is that if you did have it in your gardens, its presence would have made itself known already in a big weeks, sort of a big way about 4 to 8 weeks ago. Now, Japanese knotweed is really able to present itself in pretty much any environment. It has no preference as to where it lives or where it situates itself. It's an extremely hardy species, and some of these places can be quite surprising. Roadsides, woodland paths are not uncommon, and often, despite the attempts to limit its spread across the UK, its presence alongside public areas is because the rhizomes, those root systems, are transported in small amounts within tire treads or the treads of people's shoes. This is quite a known issue for building and construction sites, where daily transportation of material to and from different sites spreads those fragments of the root system. And it's key here to understand that Japanese knotweed is something that grows from its roots and spreads as a result of its root system. Those small white flowers we saw in the previous screen, they have no sort of flower seed spreading ability. So you don't get that sort of drift of seeds going into a neighboring location. It is all about where those roots are situated. And if they are moved to another location, that's where you can then get an outbreak of Japanese knotweed. Now, railway sidings are a particularly common place for Japanese knotweed to be found, because in a lot of cases it was planted there deliberately. The reason was that before the destructive nature and issues with knotweed were known, it was considered to be a great sound barrier to protect nearby residents from train noise. So, for those of you that maybe have clients buying or with purchase of the properties alongside railway sidings, it is worth checking to see whether or not Japanese knotweed is situated near those properties. Now, the knotweed had the added advantage, of course, from a sort of sound protection point of view, that it grew very quickly and was a cost-saving measure. And of course, the problem is that trains that maybe pass alongside the Japanese knotweed can transport the rhizomes to different areas alongside the track. Now, as you can well imagine, there are many impacts of having Japanese knotweed in or within close proximity to your property. And the issue has a sort of a gradually increasing profile within the industry press, partly because it's a very visual issue. The sight of gardens or like is sort of overtaken by this sort of vast forest of Japanese knotweed can make quite good news stories, but also because the legal framework around Japanese knotweed creates more and more opportunities for essentially for prosecution or for legal cases if voluntary cleanup of Japanese knotweed isn't carried out when it is spreading onto or affecting neighboring properties. There's no statutory obligation to eradicate ground Japanese knotweed from your property, but there is an obligation to consider it should it start to sort of spread across on your property. Plus, of course, you've got the self-interest in the event that the Japanese knotweed on your own property is starting to damage your buildings, and say we'll come onto the legal element in a short while. Now, the articles on the screen do highlight some of those more severe impacts and consequences. And the first headline on the left-hand side relates to action taken by Bristol City Council, acting on behalf of the owners of 7 neighbouring properties. The council took legal action against MB Estates, on whose property a sizable knotweed infestation was located. And they failed to act on the infestation, were prosecuted and ultimately fined by the local authority. Now, this was actually the first time that Japanese knotweed prosecution had been carried out under ASBO legislation. We'll come back to that in a couple of slides' time. But it does give an example whereby landlords have a responsibility to monitor their properties and stop the spread of Japanese knotweed if it exists on their properties. And it's interesting, of course, the majority of, as far as we can find, no standard landlord's insurance includes cover for Japanese knotweed appearing on their property. Now, of course, there can be quite different behaviours for those of us that are, those people who are property owners. You're perhaps a little bit more aware of what's going in your property compared to people who are letting properties. I don't mind admitting, as a student, I didn't really know what was going on in the back garden of my property. So landlords perhaps have that sort of slightly greater exposure to keep checking their gardens to make sure that Japanese knotweed isn't there, because the moment it's there and starts to impact on the property itself or neighbouring properties, they can find themselves liable for cleanup costs and legal action in the event that they don't carry out those cleanup activities. Now, the second headline refers to how floodwater can carry the rhizomes downstream for miles so that it can respawn in new places. As I mentioned, it just takes that tiny part of the root system to grow and reproduce independently. And the third case really speaks for itself, and you can see this poor lady standing on her own backyard enclosed by a forest of knotweed, and she's, at the time that this story happened, was unable to sell or remortgage her property without the presence of what would be for her, that's a very sizable residential outbreak, fairly expensive or substantially expensive Japanese knotweed management plan. Now, in their search for moisture, Japanese knotweed roots and rhizomes can interfere with drainage pipes and other structures, blocking and sometimes lifting pipework or clogging sumps and drainage pits. And other ground infrastructure can be put at risk, such as cabling. And of course, even where you have dormant root systems, in the event that you have to excavate the land to maybe replace pipework, drainage systems can and do expire. That excavation could sort of reactivate dormant Japanese knotweed roots and create the outburst of the plants that you can see on screen. Knotweed can also exploit existing weaknesses in property, such as walls and foundations of fences and conservatories, and the rhizomes will forge their way through structures without regard for their purpose. And as I say, it's not uncommon to see buildings, be they residential or commercial, where the rhizomes have actually forced their way through the building structure and potentially are now appearing inside the property itself. And the aerial growth provides very dense cover, as you can see from the previous image of the lady standing in her garden, reducing the ability of indigenous plants to grow. And it can reduce the usable area of the garden substantially, obviously reducing leading to a loss of the enjoyment of the property. Now, there's nothing, of course, that stops a property owner removing Japanese knotweed from their property, but it has to be taken away to a controlled environment. It can't just be dumped at your local tip for reasons we'll come on to on the next slide. Now, there are three main acts that control the spread of Japanese knotweed, and it's worth noting, as I've mentioned, that there's no statutory requirement to remove or treat Japanese knotweed, but it is the owner's responsibility to ensure that the outbreak doesn't spread. Now, the acts that cover Japanese knotweed are primarily the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981, the Environmental Protection Act of 1990, and the Anti-Social Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act of 2014, better known as the ASBO Act. And when that act was first put in place, it wasn't originally designed for Japanese knotweed, but recent reforms to it have made it an applicable piece of legislation for dealing with Japanese knotweed issues. And the Wildlife and Countryside Act sets specific guidance for the spread of non-native species that have caused serious problems within the UK, its environment and its infrastructure. And essentially, it's an offence to cause Japanese knotweed to grow in the wild under the provisions made within Schedule 9 of the Act. And the Act states that if any person plants or otherwise causes to grow in the wild any plant which is included in Part 2 of Schedule 9, which Japanese knotweed is, he shall be guilty of an offence. Anyone convicted of an offence under Section 14 of the WCA may face a fine of £5,000 and or 6 months imprisonment, or 2 years and potentially an unlimited fine on indictment. The Japanese knotweed, as I say, is listed on Part 2 of that schedule. Both the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 81 and the Environmental Protection Act of 1990 control the disposal of Japanese knotweed. The EPA stipulates that Japanese knotweed, classified as controlled waste, can only be disposed of at landfills which are licensed to handle contaminated soil. The individual or organisation that's collected the knotweed is responsible for identifying a licensed landfill and transporting the knotweed to the licensed handler. So, as I say, should you find it on a property, don't take it down to your local tip, because should it be discovered, you're liable to get a fairly sizable fine. Untreated knotweed is not regarded as hazardous waste under the Hazardous Waste Regulations of 2005, but material containing knotweed that's been treated with certain herbicides could be. Now, we come then on to the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act. So ASBOs were introduced into the fight against Japanese knotweed as part of a reform of that legislation. And the reform now allows for ASBOs to be issued against individuals or businesses that don't control Japanese knotweed when they could reasonably be expected to do so. And it was under this legislation that a company called MB Estates in the Bristol area were prosecuted after several attempts to get voluntary action. And there have been subsequent prosecutions of landowners where knotweed has impacted on a neighbouring property. And as I say, it perhaps puts an extra level of scrutiny onto landlords, be they professional landlords or those that do have a property or two that they lent out, even if it's not their primary revenue stream, to keep an eye on Japanese knotweed and make sure that it is found, it's dealt with quickly, because you are exposing yourself to legal action in the event that you don't deal with that knotweed. Now, ASBOs are typically restricted by nature, so an owner of a property issued with one will likely be required to stop the spread of Japanese knotweed. And there will be typically measures they need to take to ensure this, including making reasonable attempts to eradicate the knotweed from the property and the properties of those it has spread to. Now, this slide illustrates the potential risk associated with that spread that can be caused by a single plant in a garden. We take a look at an average sized residential garden with a property located in the middle of the plot. A single case of knotweed situated in the garden might seem quite low risk. However, if we overlay that 7-meter rhizome system that is acknowledged as the potential spread of the root system underneath an individual plant, it quickly becomes apparent that the risk has now moved not only from the property to the property, but also has encroached onto the neighbour's garden and elevated the legal risk, but potentially also the risk to their property that bit further. Now, since 2013, a seller of a property has been required to state whether Japanese knotweed is present on their property through the Law Society TA6 Property Information Form. This form was revised and further guidance was added in February 2020 with the release of the 4th edition. And the guidance to sellers now is that if they're unsure whether Japanese knotweed exists either above or below ground, or whether it has previously been managed on the property, they should answer not known. If no is chosen as the answer, the seller must be certain that there is absolutely no knotweed present, not even a root. And the guidance goes further, asking the seller to confirm that the plant does not exist within 3 meters of the property boundary, even if there are no visible signs above the ground. And this really puts the onus on the seller to actually check neighbouring properties and land, which is obviously difficult to do so. So really, in practical terms, if you are inclined to tick no, it's taking on quite a sizable exposure as a seller, because it's incredibly difficult to be absolutely certain. And I'm absolutely sure that not known has become far and away the default answer in relation to this question. And we'll come on to what that then mean for our prospective purchaser in a slide or two. So we've discussed the origins and problems that Japanese knotweed causes, but exactly how do you get rid of it? Well, as mentioned previously, there's no statutory responsibility to eradicate or treat knotweed, but its presence creates significant risk to property if it's close enough, and legal and financial risk in the event that it spreads onto neighbouring land. And of course, in addition, most mortgage lenders, whether you're remortgaging or acting in a purchase, will not lend on a property that has Japanese knotweed without a insurance-backed eradication plan being in place. And we'll come on to the nature of those plans shortly. But to remove Japanese knotweed, it can be a costly and lengthy process and involves the use of very specialised professional firms who specialise in the treatment of knotweed and other invasive species. And there are really 3 methods that they may choose, depending on the budget, and obviously ultimately the client has the choice, may choose to eradicate the problem. By far the quickest, but also the most costly method of removing Japanese knotweed is to excavate the plant, its roots, and any potentially contaminated soil, and take the waste to a licensed landfill site. The process usually takes 1 to 2 weeks, meaning that building or landscaping works can commence with no restrictions once the excavation is carried out. The soil that's excavated from the site quite often needs to be sifted and inspected by hand, hence often one of the contributing factors to the high cost. So to give you an idea of the potential cost of this, a small immature outbreak in a residential garden might be somewhere between £10,000 to £15,000 to have the excavation method of extraction. And of course, then that may include a bit of rudimentary landscaping, but you then probably have to slightly put your garden back together again. Because of the budgetary constraints, most outbreaks on residential properties will be treated by one of the two following methods. Now, if you've got a quite sizable outbreak, foliar spray is probably the method that's going to be preferred. And this is where herbicides are applied to the top and underside of the leaf. And this is absorbed and carried into the plant, and repeat applications of the herbicide cause the plant to become stunted and reduce its capacity to photosynthesize and regenerate. And you can expect over the course of 3 years, the plant will die back completely. Where you have smaller concentrations of Japanese knotweed, the stem injection process is usually the one that's followed. And this involves injecting a specific dose of the herbicide directly into the stems of the plants. The benefits are that it can be done in all weathers, and it reduces the impact of potentially damaging non-target plants as well. You know, if you've got neighboring trees or shrubs that you're quite fond of. So it's a quite targeted solution. It's also a particularly effective solution where nearby trees have a preservation order and the foliar spray principle may damage them. Now, both of these treatments are far cheaper than excavation, but take place over a longer time frame. An average residential outbreak may cost £3,000 to £5,000 over a 5-year period, which usually consists of 3 years of treatment followed by 2 years of monitoring. And during that period, the treated area must stay undisturbed. So you can mow the lawn, but you couldn't carry out any landscaping works, you know, plants and vegetables or flowers or whatever else you might choose to do with that plot of the garden. Most treatment companies will accept staged payments across the lifespan of the project, except where the property is up for sale. In those instances, they generally ask for payment for the entire project cost up front. And of course, with the majority of lenders not willing to lend on a property without that treatment plan being in place, a seller really has very little choice but to put that management plan in place. Now, most specialist contractors will provide a 10-year insurance-backed guarantee for all types of eradication treatment. And this policy would start at the end of the treatment and monitoring period. And once again, this guarantee is pretty much universally required by lenders. While the insurance does generally cover reoccurrence of the knotweed in the treatment area, the majority of policies will exclude any outbreak that arises if the occupier has disturbed the treated area. So essentially, beyond mowing the lawn, you're looking at land lying untouched for 15 years through the treatment, monitoring, and 10-year guarantee period. Now, a common question, and indeed a valid one, is can surveyors spot Japanese knotweed? And although, of course, they have that professional capacity and probably a far greater awareness of the issue than members of the public, they still fall foul of just how, I suppose, to some degree, subtle this plant can be. You know, you have that spread of the root system beyond the location of the source plant. It can lie dormant for some period of time. So, although, you know, on recommendation of solicitor, most people will go ahead and get a survey. It is difficult for a survey to establish whether Japanese knotweed exists at the property currently or indeed in the past, unless you have that evidence of current growing. We've spoken to several of our contacts who are surveyors, and they say they will always try to be vigilant and look for existence of the plant, you know, in the property or close to the boundaries. But, you know, taking into account how subtle it can be, along with restrictions to adjoining land or, you know, masking by fences, it's not an easy task. So really, your surveyor is going to be finding it quite difficult to ascertain whether or not Japanese knotweed has had any sort of foothold close to or in the property that your buyers are looking at. So, given the TA6 form, given that it's an invasive, subtle, and you know, strong to persist plant, how could you protect your purchaser? Well, we suspect, as I say, because of those changes to the TA6 form, the vast majority of answers are going to say not known in relation to Japanese knotweed. As a result, CLS Property Insight can now offer a Japanese knotweed indemnity policy. Cover is available for residential properties at a premium of £40 and for commercial properties for £100 up to half an acre size. So you can provide that, hopefully, that peace of mind to your clients that in the event they find themselves on a property where Japanese knotweed is breaking out, they have cover for the remedial work that they may need to undertake. Our policy has no hidden exclusions to allow for a smoother claims process. For example, some policies have an exclusion that says that if the Japanese knotweed could have been discovered by visual inspection or survey, the policy is excluded. Ours is not. If they move into a property and then spot a news article 3 months later and realise they've got it in the garden, the policy is there for them should they wish to activate it. It has a £20,000 limit of indemnity, so you can see hopefully that covers the majority of costs that a typical residential case might cover. As I say, a typical case may be £3,000 to £5,000 worth for a small outbreak, and so going slightly higher than that for a slightly more substantial one. And it covers buyers, lenders, landlords, and successors in title. The point to perhaps note is that the policy has a 5-year life to it. It needs to be activated within 5 years of the inception date, but it provides cover for costs and expenses arising from compliance by the insured with any remediation notice or completion of remediation works identified in a Japanese knotweed survey. So essentially the management plan costs will be covered by the policy. And indeed, if there is an enforcing authority, so maybe the local authority or environment agency end up carrying out the works, the policy again will cover their costs rather than the insured, the homeowner having to dip into their own pocket. In addition, subject to that limit of £20,000, the policy also covers the cost of altering, repairing or demolishing any part of the property as a result of damage caused by Japanese knotweed. And of course, that may allude to the house itself, but equally it might allude to decking or concrete foundations or something along those lines that form part of the garden, maybe where the Japanese knotweed is situated. And there is provision in the policy for additional costs that may be incurred to be contributed to by the policy with the written consent of the insurer. So for £40 in a residential context, potentially sort of long-term damaging costs can be dealt with. And really the statements of fact that surround this policy are solely for those properties that are conditional on the insured party not being aware of Japanese knotweed having been situated previously on the property or in the nearby area. But if they weren't aware, then the policy can then act for them. And the statements of fact are pretty clear. I'll not go through each and every one of them, but you can see there that really perhaps it's statements sort of D, E, and F that indicate that requirement not to have known about Japanese knotweed prior to taking out the policy. The majority of home buyers would be in exactly that situation. Most are quite ill-informed about the characteristics of knotweed. So we hope that provides a good route for you to protect your clients in the event that they're moving into a property and see that not known statement on the TA6 form from the seller. So to recap what we've looked at today, we've looked at the history of the plant and how it was introduced into the UK with no understanding really of the subsequent consequences. We've taken a look at the plant's behaviour and how it thrives pretty much anywhere it's taken and the damage, unfortunately, that it can cause to land and property. We've looked at the image of the plant, how to identify it throughout its annual cycle and stages of growth. And we've considered the implications of the recent guidance changes for the TA6 form. Look for that not known. And we've looked at the controlling bodies that are responsible for monitoring and policing it. And as I say, it's interesting to see how the ASBO legislation has evolved now to provide a legal route for someone wishing to take action against someone that allows Japanese knotweed to persist on their property. And then finally, we can confirm that legal indemnity insurance is available for £40 for residential properties and from £100 for commercial properties. Currently, you can get that offline, i.e. not on the InfoTrack and CLS websites, but it can be offline ordered from our underwriters. So if you do have a requirement for the policy right now, please come to us via the InfoTrack help desk, and we're only too happy to help. But from around the 4th of July, we'll be going live with this policy on our website, and we'll be working with InfoTrack to have that change reflected on their site as well. So you'll be able to access this policy with the same sort of ease that you access the other CLS legal indemnities via the InfoTrack platform. With that, we bring the webinar to a close. My thanks to Adam and the team at InfoTrack for once again setting up the webinar. It's much appreciated. And my thanks to all of you for listening. And Adam, at this point, I'll bring you back in if that's okay.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. Some of these, I think you may need to go back to your underwriters before answering in full, but if we go through them and you can advise. So the first question is, hi, if there are two adjoining properties, both with Japanese knotweed, owner A wants specialist treatment to remove these from his property, but owner B refuses to remove their Japanese knotweed. It's likely that the Japanese knotweed can easily grow back into owner A's garden. What is the best advice for owner A when the local council would not intervene?
Yeah, it becomes ultimately where is it possible to identify where the knotweed has emerged from? Is it property A or property B, which was the original source of the knotweed outbreak? That may then create the liability for, create a responsibility for one party or the other to take the lead in the cleanup. So, for example, there have been scenarios where the management plan actually takes into account 2 and even 3 properties, but is paid for and contributed to by just, let's say, property owner A. And that management plan can include the 10-year guarantee for each of those sort of individual properties that are affected. Obviously, that takes a degree of collaboration between the two neighbours. If the neighbouring parties can't agree on where it started or just refuse to collaborate, then ultimately my suspicion would be that the ASBO legislation starts to come back in, because, as I say, although there's not a statutory obligation to deal with knotweed if it's just existing on your property, the moment it starts going into someone else's, and of course that going into someone else's might not be the visible signs of growth above ground. It can be the root system as well. They have that responsibility to clean it up. So the ASBO legislation was actually changed because prior to the change there wasn't an effective legal route that a council could take action. The MB Estates case in Bristol was actually the first use of ASBO legislation, and the Japanese knotweed that had been growing on this particular property and affecting the seven neighbours had existed for some time, and many attempts at voluntary remediation had been tried, but the company just wouldn't engage. So in the end, the local authorities should really act in the event that someone is allowing Japanese knotweed to persist back into a neighbouring property who's done the right thing and tried to have it cleaned up. As I say, if you can't get that collaboration, then the authorities should be acting.
Thank you. Okay, this should be an easy one. Is the limit of indemnity based on the purchase price?
No. So this is one of the key distinctions between the usual sort of legal indemnities, restrictive covenants, and whatever else that CLS does, and the Japanese knotweed. With the other legal indemnities, we have that sort of flexible limit of indemnity, sort of up to goodness knows what. We have done indemnities up to £10 million in the past, although they're few and far between. But with the Japanese knotweed policy, the limit of indemnity is set at £20,000. If you need a higher indemnity than that, then that would become a bespoke policy, and we'd certainly consider it. But presently, the standard online policy, or at least the policy that's going online on the 4th of July, that limit of indemnity is £20,000.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, another question here. Please explain the implication of answering no on the previous 3rd edition of the TA6, but following completion, the buyer has found Japanese knotweed. What impact does this have on the seller, and is the seller responsible to cover the costs if they did not have any knowledge? That's
a really good question. If you don't mind, I'll take that one offline. Yeah. But Adam, when I reply back to your attendee, I'll send you obviously the answer as well, and you feel free to distribute that to anyone who's attended. I'd like to make sure I answer that properly, if that's okay.
Okay, there are a few more bespoke questions which I'll ask you to go back to the individual clients on, actually, Steve. So for Sean Gardner, we'll come back to you. For David Max Wiley, we'll come back to you as well. I think rather than going through those, and also Iqbal, we'll come back to you yourself as well, as in the short term. Probably, would you be able to do that this afternoon, Steve?
It would be this afternoon or tomorrow, once I've sort of gathered in replies from the underwriters and so on, if that's the nature of the questions. But I'll give that sort of give them immediate attention. Okay. And Adam, would you mind if I asked sort of a question to those still on the line? As I say, we have this policy going online on the 4th of July, and one of the things we thought would be useful, and I'd welcome maybe if you can drop a line to Adam to confirm if it is if we were to launch the policy, but with some draft text that you can include into your letters, words to the effect of, the seller has declared not known in relation to Japanese knotweed, due to the nature of the issue, both from an environmental and a legal perspective, we recommend these are the actions that you as a buyer may wish to take. So we're trying to give you some draft text that you as law firms could include within your letters to alert your clients to the risk, and then to have act on whatever course of action. So if that would be useful, please do drop Adam a line, and we'll get something drafted that will go alongside the release of the policy online.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Okay, so I will call an end to the webinar there. Thank you to everyone who's attended today, but also thank you, Steve, for such an informative webinar. All that's left for me to say is enjoy the rest of your day. And if you haven't already, we have a fraud webinar on Thursday this week. So if you go to InfoTrack, under the About and Events, you'll find the link to register for that if you haven't already and you're interested in listening in. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.